everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. Really excited to get started. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. So we would like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kma'ki people. We are honored to work and serve on this land. The Blue Nose Ability Arts and Film Festival stands with the protesters across Canada, the United States, and across the globe, demanding an end to police brutality and racism. We acknowledge the deep and powerful challenges faced by the Black community in Nova Scotia, Canada, and beyond. Black Lives Matter. So today's workshop that we're going to be doing today is about grant writing for the arts. And I'm joined today with my co-host, Heidi Hallett. Hi, Heidi.
Hi.
How are you doing today?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I'm really excited to be here with you. I'm glad you are my partner in this. We're gonna crush it.
Yeah, it's gonna be great.
Okay. So I'd like to start today by just going over sort of the shape of what this workshop's going to look like for everyone. And before I do that, actually, I want to first acknowledge something about grant writing. And that is that grant writing isn't very accessible to everyone. And by that I mean, if you're a person who relies on income assistance or disability support, that writing a grant and receiving funding can come with some added complications. And so we're aware of that. So if you're interested in writing a grant, but you're concerned about it affecting your income support, I just want to let everyone know that you can contact us at hello, HELLO, at BAAFF.ca, BAAFF.ca, and we'll see what we can do to help get you some answers, help you facilitate the process if you're interested in writing grants. So today's workshop, we're going to start off by giving you a little introduction as to who I am and who Heidi is and why we're here talking about grants. And then we're going to talk about the grant writing mindset. And then we're going to do some overview of some specific funding programs, some writing tips, and yeah. And I'm excited to get started. Let's go. So I'll introduce myself first. So my name is Kelsey MacDonald. I'm a social media and communications, I don't want to say expert because I'm definitely not that, but that's what I do here at Reachability and the Blue Nose Ability Arts and Film Festival. I also do a lot of logistics planning. So I'm usually not on camera. I'm usually behind the camera. So this is new for me, new for all of us, but I'm excited to be here. In terms of grant writing, I've written, I don't want to say many, but I've written some successful grants here with Blue Nose Ability Arts and Film Festival, with Reachability Association, and with some other organizations that I've worked with in the past. And I'm also a certified teacher. I don't know why that's very important, but I just like to tell people because I worked very hard to become a certified teacher. And I'm joined here today with Heidi Hallett. Heidi!
Hello, how are you?
I'm really well. So Heidi, I'll let you introduce yourself to the people.
Yeah, I am a mixed media artist, and my career background is mostly in communications and marketing. I run my own small business here in Halifax called Hatched Halifax, and I do a lot of consulting and teaching and freelance type stuff. Mm-hmm. I have experience with grant writing as well. I've worked with several different arts organizations in Halifax, writing grants for them, mostly in the literary field and with writers and authors. I've also worked with a few individual authors in terms of prepping and tidying up their grant applications. I've done a lot of writing and communications work, so it all lends to this type of work. Yeah.
So I think today we're going to go over this presentation together. We're sort of going to have a little bit of a back and forth, you and I. And then hopefully we're helpful to somebody that's interested in starting this process. And just specifically, this grant writing workshop is grant writing for the arts. But if you have questions about grant writing in other areas, again, feel free to send us an email at hello@baaff.ca. So we're going to start and I think this is really important, by setting a positive and creating a positive mindset. So the first question that I like to ask people in terms of grant writing is, what is great about grant writing? And my response usually to that question is, you get funding to make art. And that's great, right? Oftentimes I think we can think super negatively about grant writing because it is a long process. It takes a lot of mental capacity to write a grant. There's a lot of work that goes into them. And so if we set ourselves up with that sort of mindset, then we're not going to look forward to writing our grants. So Heidi, what are some other great reasons about grant writing? What do you love about grant writing?
Well, I mean, the first thing that you said about it, gives you money to do your art. I think it's an opportunity to reach for artistic goals that you may not have considered in the past. A lot of the times we think, oh, what could I do? And money's the obstacle. So you start thinking about, what could I do if I actually had the funds to do this? The other thing that's great about grant writing, I think, is just something that's great about writing in general, is that it's a really transferable skill. You can spend the time, and it may be many hours, days, weeks, whatever, doing a grant application. But as you're going through that process, that's a really good skill to have for other application-based things that you want to do in the future, whether it's applying for a job or applying to be part of a festival, or maybe you want to get your work shown in a gallery, or you want to do a residency somewhere like Reachability or various different arts groups. These are all application-based processes that you have to go through. So you can take the knowledge that you've gained while you're doing your grant writing and apply it to these other things. The other thing, which sort of comes back to my first point, is it helps you really develop your ideas and really crystallize them in your own mind. Yeah,
that's a big one. I think when you're writing a grant, sometimes, you have an idea in your head of a project that you want to work on, but you don't always spend the time to think of some of the smaller details, and grant writing forces you to do that. You sort of have to think big picture, and you might learn stuff about your project that you didn't have the answers for before. And I think that clarifying through the process of grant writing is especially helpful when you're trying to create a new piece of work. The other thing too is, I think when you write a grant, it also pushes you a little to make your project, because you have to start thinking about, you have this idea of an art project, but then you have to start thinking about logistics and other things, right? And you have to start connecting with local artists and organizations in your community to help you create the project. And once you've started that process, the project can start to feel real, and you can sort of start to see the light at the end of the tunnel. I can actually do this. I have the support. I have all these things. So even if you don't get the funding, even if you're not successful in your grant application, you still might be able to do the project just because you've gone out of your way to sort of get the support materials and get the support from your community as well. So in some regards, it's not always about a successful grant. Sometimes just the process of writing a grant can be really helpful.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. It gives you the space in your brain to really plan, because as you're writing your grant, and we'll talk more about this a little bit later, but you really need to sort of go through it all mentally in your head and figure out what exactly are the steps, what's the process, and really taking into account every little detail. And that is a really great way to set yourself up for success, whether it's with the grant or just with the art project. Exactly.
So the next question is, and this one's a big one, what makes grant writing so hard? So it's a lot of work to write a grant, and there's no guaranteed outcome. So, you can write the greatest grant, but you'll never be certain whether or not you're actually going to get it. And that process can sort of be like a defeating process, right? You don't want to put all your eggs in a basket and feel really hopeful and have the answer be, I'm sorry, at this time we do not have the funding for this project, and be devastated. So that's really hard, that sort of unknowingness. And I think, for myself, I identify as a person with ADHD and anxiety. And so for me, that sort of anxiety of, oh no, what if I don't get it? I probably won't get it. Sometimes I can fall into those negative thinking traps, and that can deter me from wanting to write a grant at all. So I think it's important to acknowledge those things. Some other things that we have here is creating budgets are hard too. We're going to talk a little bit about budgets later on. And writing about your own work, I think, is challenging. The hardest question that anybody ever gets asked is, tell me about yourself. When I was in theater school, we did this exercise where we had to introduce ourselves with confidence. And we had to walk to a mark, look at everybody in the room and say, my name is Kelsey MacDonald and I'm auditioning for the part of, insert a part here. And my peers had to decide whether or not I felt confident and secure. And they would give you either a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And if you got a thumbs down, you had to go back in the line. And the more you did it, the harder it got and the more insecure you started to feel. So it was a really cool exercise in sort of like showing you how difficult that is. Just to say your own name is really hard. So I think in terms of grant writing, especially creative projects, it can be really hard to sit down and get your thoughts into a computer or on paper. That can be really challenging, I think, too. What are some of the things you find challenging about grant writing, Heidi?
Well, I think, a lot of what you said rings true, because when you're talking about your art project, you're kind of talking about your baby, This is your passion project, and it's a vulnerable position to be in. Just like the exercise you did in your acting class, that's a place of vulnerability. But from that, I know you said it was horrible. You have to keep going back up and back up and back up, and it gets more anxiety-inducing and more stressful. But I think with that practice, it also becomes a little bit more natural. You can gain some confidence through that. And, just like you said, talking about yourself is one of the hardest things. And talking about your project is really talking about an extension of yourself. So it can be challenging, but I think it's the type of thing that if you practice it, if you rehearse it, if you work with other people to really get your pitch down, this is something that's coming from your heart, and that I'm trying to think of the words, but that positive approach, the reason you wanted to do this thing in the first place is going to come through in the end. It takes a level of confidence, but I definitely think it's something that people can gain, and it's also going to benefit them in so many other aspects of life.
Another challenge, I think, when it comes to grant writing is that sometimes it can be challenging if you have an idea and then trying to fit that idea within the criteria and guidelines of a grant. So you might have a vision for your project, but trying to find the correct funding stream for that project, trying to find, trying to fulfill these criteria that you're being asked of, even if you feel like, that's not really what I wanted this to look like, or that's not really what I wanted to do with this project, but in order to get this funding, I kind of have to make some compromises. So I think that like acknowledging that can be really hard too, to sort of have to go through that process of like deciding, what's vital to your project and what are things that, because of the grant's funding criteria, you have to sort of let go. And that can
you have to be a bit flexible. You have to be able to, bend things a little bit so that you can fit within the rules, the eligibility, the guidelines, all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I think you can still keep the integrity of your project there. You just might have to take it a slightly different route.
All right. So the next slide that we have is on imposter syndrome. We could do a whole workshop just on that, I think. And last night we had our Digital Matters youth do their showcase, and even with these 7 very talented artists, you'd be surprised to hear all of them talk about how they feel imposter syndrome. So normalizing that's a real feeling, I think, is really important. I really suffer with imposter syndrome all the time. Even just at the beginning of this workshop, I sort of was like, why did they pick me to do this? But I think persevering, pushing through those feelings, and knowing that everybody feels those feelings can be helpful. imposter syndrome is sort of, just to, if listeners or if viewers don't know what it means, imposter syndrome is that feeling that, you know, you're in a place or a situation, or that you don't have the skills, or that someone's going to find out that you shouldn't have got this funding, or you shouldn't be allowed to access this stuff, or you don't have the skills, or you're not professional enough, or you don't have the right experience for this grant. You think, I need more education, or I need more professional work before I should write a grant. I'm not ready now. And I think, I mean, I don't want to speak for you, Heidi, but I think what I'd like to tell people is that that's not true. You should write grants. You should do it, because that feeling, you know, it's not your job to decide whether or not your grant gets funding. That's the jury's job. That's the funding organization's job. So don't put that pressure on yourself to decide whether or not what it is you're writing is worth funding. You let the jury decide that. And taking that burden off yourself, I think, can give you a little bit more freedom to explore different funding options and just try, you know, sometimes just give it a shot. You never know.
I think it's really important to embrace the reasons you want to do this in the first place. Mm-hmm. I know that one of the things that I used to struggle with, and that almost every artist I've ever met or spoken to has struggled with, is making that statement, I am an artist. People get really awkward about it, and I used to too. I'd be like, I make stuff, I dabble, I kind of do stuff, you know, I'm creative, I've got my little business, but it took me a couple of years to just be like, no, I'm an artist. And if you are creating things, if you are making things and putting them out for the world to see, and when I say for the world to see, that world may be 5 people that are close friends of yours. You know, your world is whatever size you want to make it in terms of who you share your art with. But something I started doing a few years ago was just saying to myself every day, I am an artist, and getting comfortable with that statement. So I want everybody who's watching this, whether you're watching it live now or whether you're watching it later, to just look yourself in the mirror every day, or maybe grab a piece of paper and a pen and write it down. Yeah. Start now embracing the fact that you are an artist. Nobody else gets to define that for you. You know, people say, oh, there's a difference between being an artist and being a professional artist. Yeah. There isn't. You're an artist. You're a creator. You're a maker. And be proud of that. And like I said, it might take some practice, but the more you say it, the more you tell it to yourself, the more you will believe it. And I believe that to be true. It works for me.
I'm going to take that advice, Heidi. Every time I have to write a grant, I'm going to look myself in the mirror and I'm going to say, you are an artist.
That's right.
And it's going to make you feel better, I think. That was very moving. So we're going to move on to the next slide. Just like I've done today, find yourself a buddy. Heidi's my buddy today.
Hey, buddy.
Hey, buddy. So this is so valuable, I think, in grant writing, is having a person that you know that you can go to and ask, hey, can you read this? Can you listen to me talk for a half hour? Help me formulate my thoughts. Can you help me review this grant guidelines and criteria to make sure that I'm fully understanding what it is that's being asked of me? And also, you know, we at the Blue Nose at BAAFF, at the Blue Nose Ability Arts and Film Festival, you know, if you're having a hard time finding a buddy, contact us. I'm sure we'd be happy to help facilitate some of this grant writing stuff. If you have projects you want to pitch us, you know, we'd be happy to hear from you and be your buddy, just as Heidi is my buddy. But I think grant writing can be really lonely because, you know, it's just you and a computer typing away. And when you're doing that for a really long time, you can sort of start feeling like, whoa, this is a lot. Being able to share that burden with someone else, you know, even if you're working on a project with somebody else, that can even be just an incredible process as well. When I write grants, I tend to do them as part of the grants committee. So I'm working with a whole team of people who are there. If I just need, just a vent sometimes can be really helpful. Like, ugh, this is horrible and I hate this. I'm so tired. Just to go and get those feelings out can be helpful. Having somebody just to review what you've written to make sure that, what is in your head is exactly what you put down on paper and that it makes sense to everyone. I know another helpful tip, I think, is it can be very helpful for you to have a buddy that's in the same discipline as you, that understands the grant that you're writing. But also I'd like to sort of advocate for getting somebody who does not understand your art or the art community, doesn't understand your project, and giving them the opportunity to read your work, because it'll red flag any sort of confusing language that you might be using to the readers. It helps you to really in plain language describe your project. So my mom is an industrial engineer, very impressive, but not artsy at all whatsoever. And all through anything I've ever written, I always ask her, can you look this over? And she'll always say, I'll look at it for grammar, but I probably am not going to understand anything that's in here. And I'll say, that's just as helpful, because if it doesn't make sense to you, then it might not make sense to the jury. So I want to make sure that it makes sense to everyone.
I think that's really important, Kelsey, because jurors come from all different backgrounds and all different disciplines. They may or may not be familiar with your craft and the type of materials that you do or the process that you're trying to execute. And having that really plain language so that your ideas get across, it would be like, we have scientists try to explain the science of COVID and things like that right now. And a lot of times we need to have that distilled down into language that, the entire community can understand.
Exactly.
And you mentioned about grant writing can be a really lonely process. And it can be, sure, when you're sitting there working on the computer, but you have to realize that what you're working on is something that's going to be presented to a group of people. So if you can put yourself in that mindset that you're not just writing by yourself for yourself. If you were doing this in another medium, if you weren't writing it, say you were speaking or presenting, you would be doing that in front of people, and you want to get that same reaction out of them. So trying to put that into your writing and into your application can be really important.
Yeah, and just I know for me, writing is a struggle, because with ADHD, I'm very social. So the idea of being still and quiet and focused for a very long time, even just that idea can sometimes spark anxiety in me. I'm getting looks from off camera from the people who work and know me. So sometimes I can get a little bit anxious with the idea of I have to go sit and write. But I think you're right. I think thinking about how that project is going to bring a bunch of people together, I think that's really a great way to sort of think about, what a grant can do and the possibilities, the exciting prospects of this project if it gets funding is going to be awesome. And that's really how I sort of get over that hurdle of feeling sort of lonely and isolated writing. And having a buddy is really helpful too. So ask your friends, ask your family, ask us at BAAFF if you need a buddy, because it really does change the entire process. I think it makes it feel a little bit easier.
I think if you're lucky and you're able to get, more than one buddy, maybe you get a buddy who does do something in a similar discipline, who really gets where you're coming from. And that's the buddy that you bounce the ideas off and that you do the brainstorming with and that sort of thing. And then you get the other buddy, whether it's your mom, like you and I have both done in the past, or a coworker, or just somebody maybe that you've met at Reachability or some other group that you're a part of, who really doesn't know what you're doing, who really doesn't understand it, and you talk to that person until they get it. And through that process of talking them through it, you're making the language more and more clear. And you could even ask that person to maybe take some notes as you're talking, and they can bounce back with the feedback. There's just so many ways that a buddy system can really, really help you get where you want to be. And you can help them in return. It doesn't have to be a one-way street.
Exactly.
If you find someone who's also working on a grant, or maybe they're working on some other big project, maybe they need help with their resume or a job application. You know, you can go to a coffee shop or wherever we're able to go right now with the pandemic. You can get on Zoom like Kelsey and I get some coffee with you. But, you know, work for 20 minutes, then talk through what you've worked on for 5 minutes, and then work for another 20 minutes, and then talk through what you've worked, and just that takes away some of the loneliness too.
It's true. And also I think too, talking to other artists that are in the same like boat as you, that are writing, going through the same writing process as well, just like having that camaraderie to be like, oh, we're all feeling the same way. I know like during the months of like October through to November is like grant writing season. It can be crunch time. And I just know that like other organizations are also in crunch time for grant writing, right? So even just like calling another organization like that works in the same space as that BAAFF works, you know, I can say, oh, how's it going over there?
I can tell you, one of the arts organizations that I used to work for years, we would actually put our phones on voicemail for a week and say, we're in the process of grant writing and we really can't be interrupted during the day. You know, your message will be returned tomorrow during these set hours, but we're really focused right now and this is what we're working on. So give us that space, please, as much as you can. So I think there's something to be said for setting some boundaries for yourself as well.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to talk now about tools for success. So this might seem pretty basic, but I think that sometimes we need these helpful reminders because the sort of the basic and simple ones are always the ones that we forget first, right? Because they don't seem that impactful, but they really, really are. So the first tool that we have for everyone is to start early.
Like 1 to 2 months early.
The reason I'm laughing like that is because, you know, you can try your hardest to start early, but I always feel like it's the 11th hour over here. We're always in crunch, like getting it done. Woo! So sometimes
some people work well in that.
It's true. I mean, I know that when the pressure's on and I don't have time to be distracted, that works for me because if I'm, you know, I got months. That's months away. I can look at TikTok for an hour. That'll be okay. That's fine. So I really struggle with starting early, so I need to remind myself of this tip often because I tend to push it to the last minute. But starting your grant early is really... I was just going to
say what works for me is instead of looking at the one big deadline, you know, my grant is due on June 1st or whatever.
Right.
I take my 1 to 2 month timeline, however much I'm going to allow myself, and I try to break the process into smaller chunks and then set individual deadlines for those chunks. So it's not like I'm looking at, okay, I have to, you know, I don't know why I've got baking on the brain all of a sudden, but like I need to bake a 3-layer cake in 2 hours. Instead, you know, break it into different projects, and then if you've got those individual deadlines, it doesn't feel necessarily like you're working 1 to 2 months out because you have this first piece that you promised yourself you're going to get done in this week, and then in the second week you're going to try to get this thing done. And it just, when you break it into chunks, it's less pressure, less mistakes, less stress. And I also try to estimate my time when I'm breaking out that sort of, I'm like, oh, do I really want to spend 1 to 2 months working on this thing? Well, Heidi, it's not 1 to 2 months solid back to back. I'm going to say dedicate 2 hours every second day. I'm going to schedule it into my work day and make it a part of my routine. And then it's less daunting, you know?
And I think sometimes too, you know, that helps set us up for success if, you know, if something that we struggle with is, you know, energy. If we have a finite amount of energy and we know that we get, you know, we experience fatigue, we experience exhaustion, you know, if we push ourselves too hard, then starting early and making sure, as you said, Heidi, to like schedule things and give yourself a timeline, that can really help prevent burnout, and that's what you don't want to happen. So the next thing that we have here on our tool is to take breaks, and if you don't start early, you can't take breaks. So you really do need to schedule things out, and taking breaks can be challenging when you're under a deadline and you feel like I don't deserve a break right now. I need to get this done. But it's not always helpful to keep pushing and trying. You're not going to always write the best material. You're not always going to produce your best work. So taking a break can be exactly what you need to sort of reset your body, reset your mind, and to sometimes even just like clarify some of the ideas. Like if you're struggling with how to phrase, a specific thing within your grant about how it relates to how your project relates to community or something like that. Something that's like a little bit sort of, I don't know what the word I want to use is, but like sort of like thoughtful, like, conceptual. Taking a break, you could be sipping on your coffee and go, eureka moment, and know exactly what it is I want to go put in the grant. I know exactly how I want to say that now. But I only thought about it because I was sitting here and sort of daydreaming while I was drinking my coffee.
I think it's really important to step away from what you're working on, and that applies to your art as well. When I'm working on something, sometimes I literally need to leave the room, step away, and then you come back with fresh eyes, whether it's 5 minutes or an hour later, whatever time you need. And when you're working on a grant proposal like this, and let's say you are working on it alone, something that people who work for themselves struggle with, and I know I do as well, is remembering to take those breaks and making sure that it happens. If you think of the setting of working in an office or a retail store, wherever it is, you're working for somebody else and you're working with a group of people, your manager, your supervisor is going to make sure that you take your scheduled breaks because they understand that taking a break brings back a more efficient, well-rested, clear-minded employee.
Exactly.
So if you're doing this all on your own, you need to also be your own supervisor and make sure that you take those breaks.
Exactly.
I am very guilty of forgetting to do that. If I'm in the zone, whether it's working on an art piece or working on something like a grant application, once everything starts to click in my brain and I'm going and I'm just typing away and I don't want to stop, I can forget to drink water. I can forget to eat. 3 hours can go by and I haven't gotten up and moved my body around. So what I've learned over the years, and it's not foolproof because I have to remind myself to set reminders. I will either use my phone or I actually have a little egg timer here somewhere. And I will set it to remind myself that if 55 minutes has gone by and I haven't moved, I haven't gotten out of my chair, I haven't stretched, I haven't taken a few deep breaths, it's time to do that.
Yeah. I'm guilty of
scheduling breaks.
Yeah, I'm guilty of that too, like falling into hyper focus and just like not being able, like exactly like you said, I can go hours without drinking water, moving, like eating food. I can go a whole day sometimes where I've absolutely forgotten to take care of myself.
And because you find that you're not even checking in with yourself and you don't realize until you've stopped, oh yes, I have a headache.
Exactly.
My eyes are burning. My back is really stiff. It's like somehow you've tuned all of that out. You haven't connected with your body, so that's why I try to, like I said, every hour just get up and just move around a little bit. Remind yourself that, you're a human being, not just a human doing.
Yeah, a human being, not a human doing. I love that, Heidi. That's great.
I learned that in a mindfulness course about 10 years ago when I first became ill, and it's been a handy tool.
Yeah, it's a good reminder.
Two little words. A human being, not a human doing.
Our third tool is to check in with yourself, and I think that it's true. Like, if you don't give yourself enough time, and then that limits your ability to take the breaks that you need, then you're also not really taking care of yourself. And if you're not taking care, like, grant writing shouldn't be a process that, like, destroys you, right? You shouldn't need a week of vacation after you've spent a week writing a grant. That's not a healthy process. And I know that I've been in the position where I've felt that way after I've written some really hefty grants. And it's been like a very intensive, couple of weeks. But, it doesn't have to be that way. And especially if, you're writing grants as a team or as an individual, just reminding everyone to, like, drink their water, go outside, move your body, exercise, stretch, do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. Take your medication. That's a big one for me. I always forget to do that. And then it'll be 3 o'clock and I'll wonder like, whoa, why am I so like, why aren't I myself today? Oh, I know why. Or like you said, I can be in hyper focus for hours and all of a sudden I'll be like, I feel horrible. And then I'll be like, why? Oh, because I haven't drank any water. I haven't eaten all day. I've been hunched over a computer with my eyes just staring for a really long time. And that knocks you out too, right? So you kind of lose time with that process as well if you don't take care of yourself, right? Taking care of yourself allows you to get more work out of yourself in some ways.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important, and these tools may seem basic, but we all need the little reminders every once in a while for these ones.
Well, we've all done it where our telephone battery is going down, down, down. First you get the little green warning that you've got 20% left of your battery, and then all of a sudden it's red and it's flashed. And you're still ignoring it. You're just going, going, going. So we need to not ignore our internal battery warnings. And the other thing I like to comment on in terms of checking in with yourself is giving yourself a little pat on the back. Hey, I just finished that first section. I broke this into 12 or 15 chunks and goals, and look at this. I've been at this for 2 weeks and I've already checked the first 3 things off the list. That can be so incredibly satisfying and motivating to see that, I'm doing this, Yeah.
So now we're going to get into the section of this presentation where we're going to start talking about things that you need to do before you start writing your grant. And these things are really important. I know that, and this might be, something to do with my ADHD, but I know when I get really passionate about something, I can have a tendency to just rush right in. A great example is this morning, Heidi. You may remember I had to let the tech crew in, and I got so excited that I ran out of the door and every door locked behind us and we all got locked out this morning. So it's a surprise we're all here and everything's working. So I'm going to take your advice. I'm going to give myself a little pat on the back. We did do it, but we got back in the building. We got back in the building. I got too excited to let everybody in and I rushed out. And, I think that can happen in grants too. I think it's a good metaphor that you can rush into a project, writing it, and then find out after you've put a lot of time and a lot of heart into something that you're actually not eligible for it, or
that you've accidentally locked yourself out.
That you've accidentally locked yourself out of the building. And how bad does that suck? So in order to prevent those things, what we want to do is we want to, number one, read the criteria of the grant. So what is it that this granting organization is looking for? What is it that you have to be in order to fit within their funding? So, if this is a grant that, a big one is some grants aren't eligible for people who are students. So if you're a person that's attending, secondary school or post-secondary school and you want to apply for a grant, that can be one of the criteria that unfortunately they do not fund students. And so knowing that can save you a lot of work. And that's really what it is, right? You don't want to put a lot of time and effort and heart into something and find out that you're not eligible. So the other thing that's really important in terms of criteria is that a lot of grants are assessed by a group of your peers, so jurors. And these members of the jury will come from, sometimes, if it's a national grant, like for the Canada Council, they'll come from all across Canada. They'll come from different disciplines to assess your work, okay? And they have the criteria for the grant in front of them when they're going through applications. So if you have read the criteria, you know that you're eligible for this grant, and you can sort of hit those points home right up at the front of the grant. You can, use the language that the criteria uses. Make sure that you check, all the things that they're looking for, that, if this grant is only for students, make sure you tell the jury that you're a student. Make sure that you fill all those things, because they're going to be looking at the criteria while they assess your grant, and if you don't match with the criteria, then your application might get taken off the table. So knowing the criteria can be really helpful.
And I would say that if you're not sure, you've read the criteria, you've double-checked the criteria, and you're still kind of scratching your head, you're not 100% sure if you are going to fit with it, call and ask.
Yeah. And so the next thing that we say, and this is sort of similar to the criteria, but it is different. So the criteria is about you as an artist. How do you meet this grant's criteria? Who do they give their money to? And you can also check too. A lot of these granting organizations will let you know who they've given money to in the past. So if you're I don't know if I fit, you can look up other recipients of the funding, and if you think, oh wow, I'm the same as this person, then I should be eligible for this money. That's great. But reading the guidelines is helpful for you to format your ideas. Because you want to format the grant in the way that the funding organization wants to see the information. So reading the guidelines can be really helpful. It also tells you, what support material is required. And that's the last thing that you want to do when you're writing a grant, is find out that you need to have a support material that you don't have, and you either have to make it, or it could be something like a support letter from another organization, and you don't want to leave that to the last minute, because you want to make sure that if you're asking, BAAFF, for example, to write you a support letter saying that, we support this artist and we want to feature their work at one of our festivals, you want to give us the time and the ability to write that letter for you the best that we can. We don't want to feel rushed either. So knowing that in advance can allow for you, and again, this comes back to starting early as well, that you can ask the people that you need to ask for support materials well in advance, so that they have the time and the ability to give exactly what you ask for. And then you have time to review it, right? To make sure that it's exactly what you need it to say, that it's the right format, all of those things. So that's really important too.
If I can touch on that for a sec, Kelsey,
sure.
I would also recommend that if at all possible, ask more than one person to write a letter for you. But when you first reach out to that person and you ask them if they can write a letter, acknowledge that, their time is valuable, and ask if it's okay if you circle back to them at a set time, whether a week or two from now. Can I check back in with you, see if you've been able to do it yet? Just so that you're not sitting at home wondering, did they write it? Did they write it? Oh, shoot, I'm afraid they didn't write it, and it's going to be due soon. You've already laid the groundwork, but they're expecting to hear from you again, so it doesn't feel like you're bugging them or harassing them, because you've already asked their permission to circle back to them at some predetermined time to see if it's coming along.
And another thing that I think the guidelines help too is it helps you to see the big picture, right? So you know exactly what the organization is looking for, the kinds of projects that they're going to fund, and knowing those things in advance can help you to sort of formulate your ideas and think about your project in the big picture, so that when you start writing, you already know sort of the journey that you need to take throughout this writing process, and you've already sort of done the brainstorming and the thoughts that you need. And it also helps to, make sure that your project fits within what this organization is looking for, right? If they, if you're going to write a grant and part of the grant is having a public display, you need to take into consideration, I need to know that in advance, and I need to start thinking about different organizations I'd like to partner with for this presentation, and all those things. The guidelines, reading those guidelines and making sure you fully understand those guidelines are really important.
I think getting to know the funder's mission statement is also really important. Yeah. You can often find a mission statement on their website or in some of their support materials, and really understanding why it is they want to fund projects like this can be a really good place to come at this from. And another thing that I like to suggest, and I know this isn't a possibility for someone, but if you are able to handwrite a written list and actually rewrite the guidelines yourself, word for word, but just that process of writing it down can help to sort of cement it and verify it in your own brain, and will help you to retain the guidelines a little bit more. If handwriting is not an option for you, maybe you're a person who prefers to make verbal lists, or maybe you dictate to your phone. Whatever method works for you, I find that taking a few minutes to really spend time with the words and repeat them in your own voice helps to, gain that understanding and clarity of what it is you're trying to do.
Yeah, and I know, when we were discussing this, like one of my things that I do when I sit down to write a grant is I go through the guidelines and I highlight them all in the computer, and then I copy and paste them into a Word document, and I just leave all the words there kind of like a Mad Libs. So like whenever I'm like writing and I think like, okay, I need to use this word, so then I'll copy that word and I'll put it right in, and I'll find a way so that I can include it. And as I go, I'll delete the words, and that way I know like, oh, okay, like I've used the majority of the words in the guidelines, so that as the jurors are reading this, they're going to see all the things that they're asking for exactly in my writing, so that it makes sense, and just shows them that I've read the guidelines, I understand, and I know that this project fits there. And so I think that's a really good tip too.
I love that idea of highlighting the keywords and the buzzwords that are going to jump off the page for them.
Yes.
And I would say too that once you've used those words once or twice and you don't want to be too repetitive, that's a great time to get out your thesaurus or go online to the online thesaurus and find some synonyms.
Or the good old right-click synonyms. That got me through university. Right-click synonyms. So the next slide that we have is, and the next sort of before you begin, and this is, I think, the one that I struggle with a lot, is talk to your program officer. I don't want to bother them, I always feel like they're super busy people. They don't want to hear from little old me asking a little question. Yes, they do. They do want to hear from you. That's their role in this process, is to be your person, to ask questions. It can be challenging, especially if you're in an unfamiliar art form, or you're sort of like, creating your own unique space where you create interesting and unique things. It can be really challenging to understand whether or not your art practice fits within a specific funding stream, right? If you're not sure, like, I do mixed media, where does that fall? Is it film and video production, or is it visual arts? Like, where do I fit in? How do I apply? Those kinds of questions are really helpful to ask your program officer. And there's been definite times where I've reviewed guidelines and everything and thought, 100%, we got this. We spoke to our program officer and they informed us we were not eligible. And so just knowing that, you can think that you fully understand what's expected of you, and there could be some small, little detail about you as an artist, or if you work with an organization, your organization, that can, stop you from accessing funding. Or you could be accessing funding in the completely wrong stream, and there's a whole whack of money over here that your project fits in, but it's less known, and your program officer will say, whoa, this isn't the right stream for you. You got to apply over here, because that's where you're going to get the funding that you're looking for, and you could get a lot more. So that can be really helpful too. Some program officers do make decisions about funding, so like talking to them too can help you to like understand, why you might not receive funding. I've had those conversations on the phone before where I ask, is it worth our time to apply for this grant? And I've had a program officer say, if I'm being honest with you, no, because we've already assigned most of the funding for this year, so we're not going to be giving any more out. So, save your spoons. Don't put a lot of time into this, because the likelihood of you receiving funding for this project is low. And so that can be helpful too, just to know those things. And the other thing is to always be honest with your program officer, right? So, if they ask you a question and you're not sure of the answer, say that you're not sure. Or if they ask you a question about, yourself or about the project, and it has to do with whether or not you'll be eligible for the funding, don't lie about it, because chances are you won't get the funding if you don't fit. And trying to, what is that saying? Put a square in a circle.
Yeah, square in a hole, circle in a square peg.
I never know. I don't know why I try those. If my husband's watching, which I hope he is, he'll laugh at me right now because he'll say, "I don't know why you always try to say those sayings if you don't know them." Why do I do that? I always do that. But yeah. So talking to your program officer is really important, and it's also really helpful to speak with them about and getting to know them, because they might call you and say, "Hi, we're starting a new funding stream, or we're opening a new program, and I think you and your organization, or you as an artist, would fit perfectly in this." And so building that relationship with your program officer is really, really important before you start your project.
I think it's worth just taking the time to shoot them an email or call and ask if you can set up a time to, have 20 minutes of their time. Be prepared, go in there with questions. And I would even say, be prepared with your questions before you call to ask for a meeting, because I have had it happen where I've called to say, "Hey, can we meet later this week, blah, blah, blah," and the program officer says, "Actually, I'm free right now." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, well, I hadn't fully fleshed out my questions yet." And that's okay too, because there's no wrong questions, there's no silly questions. As Kelsey said right at the beginning, this is their job. They are there to help people figure out how to get this funding. They really do want to help you.
And they can become your champions too, right?
Absolutely.
So making that connection, building that relationship can be really, really important. So the next slide that we have is project planning. Doing this workshop with you, Heidi, sometimes reminds me of all the things I do wrong when I grant write. Project planning. So planning ahead. Understanding, that you have to hear back, try to apply for grants with enough time that you have time to hear back. When you receive a letter from a funding organization letting you know that you were not successful at getting funding, sometimes if you apply well in advance, you might have the ability to reapply. Get the feedback and find out what was it that I said, or what was it that my application was lacking that I can build upon. So that's helpful too. And I think sometimes one of the things that can deter people from writing a project is they'll think, I don't have it all figured out.
Yeah.
So I might as well not start. I don't know where I would put this. I don't know who I'd work with. I don't know. I might as well just not try it. It might be embarrassing if I try. But you don't have to have everything figured out when you're writing a grant. Things like the venue, the date of your performance or your exhibit or the launch of your project, the full team that you're going to work with. You don't need to have those details set in stone. It can be helpful to have those things lined up or to have sort of ideas lined up. But you don't need to have those things secured already. So it's helpful to have a plan before you sit down and start somewhat, but don't beat yourself up if you don't have everything figured out. It's okay. Things change when you're writing grants. We all know this year with COVID, lots of arts organizations and arts projects, artists everywhere had to reimagine their projects that they received successful funding for this year because we weren't able to do the things that we planned on doing. So funding organizations tend to be pretty flexible with what they'll allow in terms of changing and shifting around. And that's why having that relationship with your program officer is helpful, because if you know something's going to change, right? You said you were going to perform at this art space, but a new art space opened up and you want to use that one instead. Just letting them know can be helpful, and that kind of stuff they typically are less concerned about. The things they're concerned about are if you said you were going to present in 2020, but now you're thinking 2022, that's a long time difference. So they might want to know what those changes were, why that's happening. So sitting down and sort of planning everything and having an idea of what you're thinking about, what your project needs in order to be successful, who you need to work with, is helpful, but it's not always crucial to writing the grant. You don't have to have everything set in stone, and that can be a burden that you can take off yourself. That stuff is less important, I think, and it's more about what your mission in making the art is sort of more important, I think, sometimes than having everything figured out.
I think another way to say that too, Kelsey, in terms of your mission, is figuring out how you're going to make the statement that this project is not only important to you, but why you think it's important to other people. Mm-hmm. Why you want to share this with other people can really help to crystallize your plan.
Mm-hmm. So now we're going to move on to the next section of our presentation, which is, so we've given you tips and some advice about before you start writing your grants. Now we're going to go into, okay, it's time to write. So we're going to look at some specific funding streams today. There are many other funders that we're not going to look at today. We're only going to look at 3 today just because we're aware of the time. So the 3 that we're going to talk about today are the City of Halifax, Arts Nova Scotia, and Canada Council for the Arts. And we're going to touch on these fairly briefly because the challenge with talking about a lot of these granting streams is that everybody's project is super different. And so what may be true for you, Heidi, might not be true for me. And so we don't want to give anybody misinformation, so we're going to keep things very basic. But like I've been saying throughout this presentation, if you have questions, feel free to email us at hello@baaff.ca. That email comes to me, so I'll be the one responding. And I'm happy to hear about any questions that you have about specific funding streams. And if I don't know the answer, which I probably don't, I will find the answer for you, help facilitate that process. So let's get right into it. We're going to start with the Halifax project. City of Halifax. So the Halifax project grant is due on March 20th. It's only open to organizations that have existed for 3+ years. So this is a grant that isn't not everyone's eligible for this grant. So you have to be registered with the Registry of Joint Stocks, and you can receive funding up to $25,000. So you can go on your website and see who they funded in the past and get an idea of what kind of projects have been successful, and an idea if you find out that someone you know received a grant from this program that you're planning to apply for, you can talk to them about their experience and how they framed their project, because that can be helpful. So this is really cool. So this is when I like to sort of touch a little bit on being a teacher, because when you're a teacher, you have to assess people's work. You know, I had to take courses on assessment and what that looks like. And so knowing your criteria and knowing where to focus your time and energy can be really important. And I think, especially for me with ADHD, like I need to know that I need to know what's more important so that I don't spend too much time talking about my introduction when actually the meat of the grant and what the granting organization really wants to hear is about the scope of my project. So framing yourself up to know, like, I don't really need to spend this much time on this section of the grant because it's not worth as much, whereas this section is the most important and I need to put a lot of time and energy in making sure that this is the section that's, beefy and strong.
Impactful.
So these are the funding, these are the criteria that the jurors for the Halifax project grant use. So expertise of the applicant is out of 20. Project merit is out of 25. Public access and engagement is 25. And the organizational standing and budget is out of 10. So this one's a pretty balanced sort of scale in terms of where you should put your effort. But I think it's important to know that, out of all of the streams, your expertise versus your project merit and public access and engagement, those are the two most important things to the HealthX project grant. So they want to know that your project has merit and that the public will be able to access this art here in Halifax. That's really important to the Halifax project grant. So knowing that is important because it helps you to frame, where you spend the majority of your time when it comes to writing. So it says here in my notes, expertise in the sense need not to speak exclusively to record of exhibition or length of career, but may also be applied to the broad professional capacity and an expressed ability to be innovative. So in terms of your expertise as an applicant, they're not going to give, there's less of an emphasis on, accolades and they want to just see that you have the ability sort of to, as an organization or as a group, to sort of pull this project off. And so I think that's important. So pay attention to the relative emphasis of criteria because this matters in terms of how they're going to assess. And the jury's going to have this in front of them when they're going through applications.
I've actually sat on one of the juries for Canada Council about 10 years ago. And we literally have a score sheet, and we've got a stack of 110 applications. And no matter what you think about the project, whether it pulls your heartstrings, maybe you know the artist, or you're really excited to see this project come to fruition, if it doesn't check all those boxes and the score sheet isn't adding up, you're stuck. I've actually seen it where the funders really, really, really want to give someone the funding, but for whatever reason, the score sheet is not coming out with the right numbers. And this circles back to your point earlier that if you submit early, you may then get the feedback, hey, you kind of missed the mark on this section and we need you to go beef this part up.
Exactly.
And you've got time to reapply.
Yeah. So the next funding stream that we're going to talk about is Arts Nova Scotia. And we're going to specifically talk about grants to individuals first. So these grants are typically due, they have two deadlines. So they have one in the spring and sort of one in the fall. So the first deadline is May 15th. The second deadline is November 15th. This grant is up to $15,000 for creation, $5,000 for presentation, or $5,000 for professional development. And individuals versus group, this is a fun fact that I would not have assumed, because the word individual typically tends to mean one person. But under Arts Nova Scotia, individual is one or two people. So if you are one or two people and you want to apply for a grant with Arts Nova Scotia, you can apply as under the grants to individual stream if you are one or two people. So this can be really tricky, I think, and it's important to touch on because art streams are so different. And so if you're a playwright, for example, and that's sort of, my expertise is in theater. So it takes a lot of people to make a theater presentation, to make a play. And so if you're a playwright and you want to apply for the Arts Nova Scotia grants to individuals, you work with a lot of people to produce a play. So that can be confusing, trying to understand if you fall under grants to individuals or if you fall under small groups. But generally the advice that's given in this case is that the applicants, frame your application around how this will support your process as an individual artist. So if you're a playwright and you want to write a play and you want access to funding, when you're writing your grant, frame the grant about yourself. So it can be easy to sort of say, we're a whole cast of people. Frame it so that if you're writing under this stream, you're writing about how this is going to impact you as an individual artist, how this is going to propel you, how this is going to fulfill your artistic vision. But again, it's always good to talk to your program officer about stuff like that, because sometimes it might make more sense for you to apply under a different stream. So we're going to go over the criteria for the Arts Nova Scotia grant. So these criteria are published online, but the scores are actually not published online. So I only learned of these scores from a friend who was a peer juror. So I just think that they're really helpful to know. So for Arts Nova Scotia grants to individuals, the quality of the work as evidenced by the support material is out of 5. That's 50% out of this whole score. So you can spend a lot of time writing your grant, but you need to have the best support material to accompany your grant in order for you to get the points for it to be successful. So when you're writing Arts Nova Scotia grants, it's really important to start early so that you have the time to cultivate those support materials. So there's, if you write an amazing application about your play, but your only support materials are a couple of photos, the jury's not going to get a full sort of picture of what this project's going to look like. And the other thing with Arts Nova Scotia that's a hot tip is that they're pretty finicky about the formats in which you send in your support material, and you can be disqualified if you send in a PNG instead of a JPEG. I don't know if that's exactly true, but just they have very specific formats that they want you to use, and so knowing that in advance and not sending them material that they're not going to look at, that you don't want that to happen. So make sure that you follow those things.
If I can interject for just a sec,
Sure.
Kelsey, I actually know of a case about 6 years ago where somebody was gathering their support materials and they were all ready to go, and they actually had a video for their support materials, and they were accustomed to sharing, an MPEG file or MP4 or whatever it is, or sending a digital link. And literally days before the application had to go in, they realized that they needed to have the video on a DVD.
Yeah.
And I don't have a DVD drive on my laptop anymore. I haven't for years. A lot of people don't. I have no way to burn a DVD or a CD, and neither did this person. And it was this mad scramble, and it was like, there was just an assumption that everything's digital these days and that you're not going to need a physical item. And then all of a sudden the physical item was the most crucial piece to the application. So it comes right back to the beginning of us saying, really understanding what is expected of you well in advance.
Yes, and I think it's really important too because, that's the last thing that you want to do 11th hour right before this is due, is to be scrambling, trying to fuss with technology, to export files into different formats, not fun, not recommended. Have done it before, did not enjoy, 0 out of 10, would not recommend.
If you leave it till the last minute, that is for sure the night your Wi-Fi is going to go down.
So the next criteria for the Arts Nova Scotia grants to individuals is the artistic merit of the project is out of 3, and the ability to carry out the project is 2 out of 2. So for a total, that's out of 10. So like we said, half of your score comes from your support material. So being able to show that you're able to do the work that you do. So if you're a playwright, strong support materials include archival video excerpts of other productions that you may have done in the past. It could be a script excerpt. Ideally, the script that you're writing, that you're requesting funding to work on, if that's available, that's probably the most important. So knowing those things in advance, knowing what's needed, because if that's the case, if you're applying as a playwright and you want to work on a play and you know that it's better for you to give an excerpt of the actual work that you're asking for funding for versus a piece of work that you've already done, that means you have to sit down and start writing. And if you weren't planning on doing that in this process, while you're writing the grant to still be, putting time into that project, you need to take that into consideration when you're doing all of your planning. So the next stream that we're going to talk about is still Arts Nova Scotia, but this is under grants to organizations or small groups. So these grants are due March 15th or November 15th. They have those same sort of spring and fall deadlines. And this is for up to $15,000 for production or presentation, $5,000 for commissioning, $5,000 for professional development. So for this one, you don't need to be a registered not-for-profit to apply for this one. And there's no creation grant for organizations and small groups. So this grant can cover rehearsal creation costs under production grants, but as long as you do have a public presentation is really important for this grant. So we're going to move on to the criteria for this one. It has the same criteria as grants to individuals for the small groups. So again, really putting an emphasis on support material for this. Artistic merit out of 3, and the ability to carry out the project out of 2. So we're going to move on to the next one, which is Canada Council. So before we start, here's a few things to know about Canada Council. Before you apply for a Canada Council grant, Canada Council uses a portal system. So you have to have access to that portal. So before you do anything, you need to go through that process for first-time applicants. So if you've never applied to Canada Council before, this will be part of that process. The other hot tip is don't believe them when they say you can apply any time before the start date of your project.
It's not true.
It's not true. So check the deadlines page, which is not on the same page as the rest of the grant info. And just make sure, and again, talk to your program officer, or if you don't have a program officer assigned to you yet, because this is the first time you've ever written a grant for Canada Council, then you can just email their general line, and they'll forward this email off to the person that's supposed to respond to you. And finally, and this tip is really important, it's worth applying. So a couple of years ago, Canada Council doubled their funding, and they put a huge emphasis on first-time applicants. So if you've never applied for a Canada Council grant, there is a higher chance that you'll be successful because they put an emphasis on giving funding to new and emerging artists. So that's really important to know. So if you think to yourself, I might not get it, you have a higher eligibility to get it your first time applying than you do afterwards. So that's a good thing to know. The other thing that's really important, I think, to acknowledge as well, is that there is an option to self-identify as an Indigenous, culturally diverse, deaf, disability artist, or language minority. And there are also some additional funding for Indigenous artists under Creating, Knowing, and Sharing programs. If you self-identify as belonging to any of these groups, it will break ties and ranking. So if you're thinking like, I'm not sure I want to openly identify, it can make you slightly more likely to receive the grant. So just keep that in mind. That's up to you to decide whether or not you want to self-identify. But I think it's important to know that it could help you if you're sort of matched up with another grant and you identify as part of any of these groups, that you could break the tie just in that way. So the first granting stream we're going to talk about with Canada Council is research and creation. So research and creation, it has 2 deadlines, spring and in the fall, April 8th and October 7th, and it's up to $25,000. So they have discipline-specific program officers, which means that if you're in theater, there's probably a program officer that works exclusively in theater that you're able to ask your questions to. They're very knowledgeable. So they're not as transparent so as some of the other grants organizations that we looked at. So you don't always know who that person is if you've never been linked up with them. But you can, like I said earlier, you can send a general inquiry, and you're likely to hear back from an associate program officer. Once you have an established relationship with a program officer, they can be really helpful. So this might not happen until you've applied and received a letter from your officer. That's how you'll know who they are, and that's how you'll be able to contact them. So sometimes you won't know exactly who that person is, and you can send general inquiries out. But once you get a letter from your with a successful application, you'll have a program officer that will be the person on that letter. And that's the person that you can always contact if you have questions. So in terms of the criteria for the Canada Council for the Arts Research and Creation grants, 50% of the grant is the artistic merit. So the artistic quality of your work, the artistic rationale for your project, and the potential artistic outcomes of your project are very important. The impact of your project is worth 30%. So the potential of the project to contribute to your group's artistic development and advance your artistic practice. And the feasibility, whether or not you're going to be able to carry out this project, is 20%. So your capacity and experience to undertake the project, a reasonable budget, including the ability to provide adequate working conditions. So Canada Council's sort of breakdown is very specific, and it's very focused on the artistic merit of your project. So even impact section is about artistic impact. Nothing about audience or public impact for this program, because it is about the development rather than the presentation. So knowing that that is sort of folded into this grant can be really important when you're starting out writing it. That the impact and the artistic merit of your project is sort of core to who you are as an artist. That's sort of where you fall. You need to say why your project is important now, in terms of when you're talking about the impact and the rationale. Not just what it is and how you're making it, but why it's important for it to be made right now is important. Even if that seems like obvious to you, it might not be obvious to the jury. So making sure that you make that argument that it's vital that your project is made now, and this is how it's going to impact you as an artist and your community, is really important.
That's a common problem that people have. They assume that because something is so clear to themselves, that it's going to be really clear to others, and making that point, putting the emphasis on why it's important, is just it's so important to your application.
Yeah. So the next Canada Council funding stream that we're looking at is concept to realization, and so this grant has the spring and the fall deadline of April 8th and October 7th, and it is up to $60,000, and exceptionally sometimes can be up to $100,000. Woo! So this is a big one. Very similar to the research and creation, except the added criteria regarding public engagement. So there must be a public presentation if you apply for this program. The ability to provide adequate working conditions and pay your artists is really important. And submitting a budget where you don't underpay people will count. If you underpay people, will count against you. So be very aware that you credit people, you follow. There's different, for each. There's different websites that you can go to find out like what is the average rate of pay for a specific person working on a project, and you can make sure that you're falling within Canada's regulations for that. Can be really helpful.
Whether it's writers, actors, people who are going to do admin work for your project, anything like that, you really need to get the industry rates so that you're not undercutting anybody.
So this one has artistic merit at 50%, similar to the last one, impact at 30%, and feasibility at 20%. So it's similar to the last one, but there is a difference with this grant, which is that the impact needs to have the build public interest in and knowledge of the artistic practice. So there has to be some form of public engagement with the concept to realization grant. Whoa. So the next one that we have here is concept to realization. It's April 8th to October 7th, and it's up to $60,000. Oh wait, I think I just have an extra sheet in here. That's my bad. We just did that one. I was like, that's so familiar. Why is that there? So here, Canada Council has a lot of different funding streams. So we can't cover all of them today because there are a lot. So just this slide, we'll leave up for a bit. For creating and knowing and sharing and similar criteria for research and creation, projects with both artistic and cultural rationales are accepted. If you're eligible and you self-identify as First Nations, Inuit, Métis, when you register for the portal, there are more funding streams for you to apply under. So that can be important to know as well. Specific programs if you identify as First Nations, Inuit, or Métis. All right.
A couple of things I'd like to mention about the Canada Council before we move on is just that there's a fantastic section on their website called Stats and Stories.
Yes.
And it talks about all sorts of past recipients. And, you had mentioned earlier how with some funders you can see who they've given money to. Well, this is that, but it's more in-depth. So that can be really great research to do. But the other thing that's important to note, especially when we're talking with people who may have some disabilities or some barriers, is that Canada Council often offers application assistance. I'm just going to read from my screen here for a second.
Yeah.
Who can request assistance? Individuals or the lead applicant for a group who self-identify as artists who are deaf, hard of hearing, have a disability, or are living with a mental illness, as well as artists who identify as First Nations, Inuit, Métis, artists facing language, geographic, and or cultural barriers. You can actually apply to get assistance with filling out your grant, submitting your grant, all of that stuff. So if these eligibility requirements fit you, this is a fantastic opportunity to work one-on-one with somebody at the Canada Council who can really help you put together a winning grant proposal.
Yes, and that's really important to know, Heidi, because Canada Council has the assistance. Arts Nova Scotia has funding for your project as well. So if you are successful after you've written your application, you can then apply for some accessibility funding, and that can help you to access services like ASL or closed captioning, those things that you want to have to make your presentation as accessible as it possibly can be to everyone, so that everybody can participate in your art, but it doesn't take away from the funding that you have to actually make your project. So that's really important too. So making sure that you check all the different accessibility and grants that can help you make your work accessible, but also, like you said, with Canada Council, if you need help facilitating the grant writing process, that you can access that through Canada Council as well is really important. And you can get a lot of information in terms of finding those accommodations through talking with your program officer and asking what services are available. Can be really helpful too. So now we're going to talk about my least favorite part of grant writing, budgets. So I just want to say before we start talking about budgets are challenging, and they're challenging to sort of talk about it in this format that we have here, because everybody's budget is going to look very differently. And so for us to, we're doing a very generic overview of these granting streams. So for us to get into the heavy specifics of budgets, I think would just overwhelm me and probably anyone who's joining us and watching this workshop with us this morning. So I just want to say that, and I want to say too that, we decided to do this grant writing workshop, Heidi and I, because we felt from our community, we asked, what is it that people are looking for in terms of workshops, and grant writing was the first, sort of the number one thing that people were asking us to do a workshop on. And I think that as part of the BAAFF team, we want to do more of these workshops and sort of share the knowledge that we've accumulated over the years, and sort of help facilitate young artists or new artists, emerging artists throughout this process. So if you are interested in learning more about budgets in terms of grant writing, or you have more questions about budgets that we don't cover today, again, reach out to us at hello@baaff.ca. I wish we could have had a little ticker that ran on the bottom. Email us now. Little starburst over here. So Heidi, we're going to talk a little bit about budgets. The first thing I want to say is that we're not accountants. But maybe you are. Maybe you're an interesting artist with some, you're an accounting artist. Who knows? But most of us aren't accountants. Most of us do not do budgets very well. That might be just a more personal, specific thing to me, but not always the best with the monies. And so what's great about a lot of these funding streams is that they have templates available for you. So they break things down, and they're very, I don't want to say very clear, because still they'll throw my brain for a loop, but they'll sort of break down what it is considered under this. So it's if you're looking at expenses, it'll say, these are artist fees. So break down how much money you're paying artists, and it'll say, these are the kinds of things that you can, put in this section, or this, that, and the other thing. So that's really helpful, that they do that and that those things exist. If you're looking for an accessible program to use to calculate and to format a budget, Google has Google Sheets, which is a free program that you can access if you have a Google account, which is also free to sign up for. So you can do a lot of what you can do in Microsoft Excel, you can do in Google Sheets. And that's a program, so you can even, we were talking about formatting earlier in specific formats that grants want. So if this granting organization needs to have your budget in a Microsoft Excel format, Google Sheets allows you to file save as a Microsoft Office Excel format. So that's great. So that's a really great program that everyone can have access to. So that's really, I think, the two really important things that you need to know is that, one, people don't expect you to be an accountant. Two, that they provide you with templates so you understand how they want to see the money breakdowns and what falls under which category. And three, that there's free programs out there that are fairly easy to use and will do exactly what you need it to do for the grant writing process.
I think this is one of those times, too, when asking your program officer is a great idea. If you don't understand something about what's expected of you in the budget, or you're not quite sure how you're supposed to make the budget balance at the end, is to ask your program officer. Because at the end of the day, the committee wants you to show that you are capable of pulling off this project, and the budget shows that you've really thought through all of the elements. You've figured out, what your cost of supplies are, what your cost of support people are going to be, and it just shows that you have a really solid knowledge of what you're trying to accomplish.
Mm-hmm. And I think another thing that I learned throughout grant writing that I didn't know before I started writing grants is the idea of in-kind.
Yes.
So I think it's important just to touch on that. So I think a lot of the times as artists, and Heidi, you're a great example of this, you're very resourceful. So when Heidi, even just within her art practice, she reuses a lot of recycled materials. And so I think as artists, we're a community. We work together a lot of the time to lift each other up and to accomplish projects. And so we lean on each other a lot. And in-kind is a great way for you to show your funding, in your grant, show the funding organization, that your project costs a lot, has a lot of value, but that you're being resourceful in where you're accessing that funding, right? So it shows that you've put a lot of time and thought, and that could come in, you want to use a particular venue, right? So a good example is here at BAAFF. If you ever wanted to use this lovely space that we're in today, for a project, we could give that space to you in kind, which means that we donate it to you, and it goes into, in your budget, it goes into as an expense, the cost of this space. What does this space actually cost if we were to spend money on it? And then in your revenue stream, you would put that exact same cost in your revenue because somebody donated it to you. So it's a way for you to be respectful of the cost of things, respectful of other artists who are donating their time or donating resources to you or space to you, and show the funders that, this is a big project, but that you're being very resourceful with your money. It helps them to sort of understand the scope and the scale of your project, but also your ability to make the money go the farthest as it possibly can. So I like to let people know about that because, that to me blew my mind the first time that I learned about it in terms of budgeting things. It's very important.
I think in addition to in-kind things, sort of alongside with that is bartering with other artists and organizations. It's wonderful if somebody wants to say, hey, we're going to donate this space to you, but they may in fact want something in return that's within your skill set or wagon wheel, whatever that term is, not wagon wheel. I might design and give somebody business cards or stickers for their business or their project or whatever, something that you can give back that's of equal value.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's all that we're going to do for budgets today. But again, if you have questions or you want to learn more, you want to have a whole workshop just about budgets, we can do that if we need to. It probably wouldn't be me. It would probably be someone else. But I think that if that's a conversation that people are interested in having and learning more about, then we're happy to facilitate that. So send us an email and let us know. So we're nearing the end of our presentation. Whew, I'm getting warm, so I'm excited for that. So we're going to talk a little bit about some writing tips. Now, Heidi, you were a member of the Writers Federation, so I'm going to lean on you for some really great writing tips. But these are the ones that we have in the presentation. The first one is be clear and concise. If you don't have more to say, you don't have to hit the maximum word count.
So important.
Keeping things in plain language is really helpful because it ensures that everybody's going to be able to access your application. You won't know who's sitting on the jury judging your application. You want to make sure that everybody is able to read and understand what it is that you're saying. So being clear and concise is really important. And, you don't need to talk longer than you need to. You don't need to oversell yourself. If you think you're able to get your artistic vision across in, 250 words, but the section gives you 750, then if you're comfortable with that, then I think that's okay. I think, giving yourself that reminder that you don't need to have 750 words for every section, can be really helpful in terms of the grant writing process. And I've written grants that, have given me the space to have, pages and pages, and I've just written 2 pages and had a successful outcome. So sometimes if you can just say exactly what it is you're going to do, what you're looking for, and why it's important, and you can do that in a short, compact way, I'm sure the granting jury would be very grateful to you as well. As you said, Heidi, 100 applications sitting next to you that you have to go through in a day. It's a lot of work. So short, clear, concise can help you win some favor with the jury, I imagine, as well.
I think it's a common misconception and an easy mistake to make that a lot of people think that using, academic language or professional, big words is somehow going to make your project come across as more important or more valuable, and that's just simply not true. Avoiding complication or complicated language, like you said, using small, clear words is always a great idea. My father used to make this great joke saying, never use a big word when a diminutive one will do. Which is just so silly. Why would you say diminutive instead of small?
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people find writing to be nerve-wracking, and you sit down and you've got that blank page syndrome. It can be even worse than imposter syndrome when you're just sitting there looking at the blank page and you're trying to figure out how to get your ideas out. So I recommend never approaching it from that standpoint. I think a practice called free writing can be really, really beneficial for people. It's something that I do a lot, and I do it in my art journaling as well as when I'm planning for business projects. And what free writing means is to literally just put your thoughts down on the page as they come into your brain. So we're not worrying about punctuation, we're not worrying about spelling, we're not worrying about grammar, we're not worrying about our penmanship. We are literally writing down the free-flowing thoughts that are coming through our head.
Yeah.
And this is similar to brainstorming, except that you're doing it yourself. And one of the things I like to do is set a timer and just say, okay, I'm going to write for 10 minutes and see what comes up. You had mentioned earlier, Kelsey, about, a lot of times the guidelines are asking for 750 words about something. And that reminded me of a great website that people can use called 750words.com, I think it is. And it's an application that sets a timer for you and allows you to just go and type and write and free write and get your thoughts out. And it kind of gives you these little emojis and badges and awards when you hit your target, and it encourages you to do this every day. So that's a great tool. But another thing is what I call bubble brainstorming. And after you've done your free writing, sort of going through it again and picking out the bits that really pop for you and that jump out and speak to your project. And then writing those down on a page, maybe using a system of bubbles where you've got like your project written in a big circle in the middle of the page, and then you've got all these arms coming out from it with the different pieces and the different elements. It's sort of another take on what a lot of people do with index cards when they'll break a project down and write down the bits and pieces and the important parts on index cards so you can shuffle them back and forth before you actually try to put it together in a cohesive paragraph. And essentially what you're trying to do is you're trying to come up with your elevator pitch. You're trying to explain what your project is in as quick and concise a way as possible. Let's say you've got 2 minutes of this person's time. And this is, again, when your buddy system can really come into play, because I find if you speak something out loud, it can often be more clear than writing. And you can sort of work through different challenges or questions that the person listening to you may have. Mm-hmm. So if you practice your pitch over and over again and you really ask pointed questions to your buddy, did you understand what I was describing there? Is that clear? Like, what's the visual in your mind when I'm telling you about my project? What are you seeing? And they say, oh, well, you described this and I'm seeing a bright yellow bus, and you're like, wait a minute, no, there's no bus, or there's no yellow.
Where did that come from?
And so you can really practice it that way and get it down to something that a lay person is going to understand, regardless of where they're coming from. And another thing is that this is an opportunity to really communicate what's unique about you and what you're going to bring to the project that's different. So when you're doing that brainstorming and the free writing and everything, thinking about why you're the person for this project more than anybody else can be really important as well. The other thing that I would say about writing is whenever possible, do your first draft offline. Again, I know I touched on this earlier, sitting down with pen to paper is not an option for everybody. There may be other tools that work better for you. Maybe you like to dictate or use different apps on your computer, that's fine. But to do it on plain paper rather than in the application online or a paper version of the application can really give you an opportunity to have the ideas gel and come together before you go and actually do your official application.
Mm-hmm. I think too, sometimes there's so many distractions online too. So even if using technology is the way that you do it, turning your Wi-Fi off, going into airplane mode, so you know that you're not going to be tempted to go look up a YouTube video, or you're not going to be tempted to sort of check on your socials while you're doing it. Making a space where it's just you and your thoughts, and you're just getting those things out can be really helpful. The next tip, and we've touched on this a lot throughout this presentation, is to address the criteria directly and use the exact words. Make them headings. Bold them. There's no shame. You don't have to be secretive that you're using the words from the application. I think sometimes for myself, coming out of post-secondary, I have that like plagiarism, you know, you're like, I'm so scared to plagiarize people, that you don't want to use those same words. But you know, showing the jury, showing the funding organizations that you read the application and you know for sure your project, you know, you bold those words. You let them know that you read it, that you know. And it also helps the jury to signal those words out and check their boxes as they go. So do that. There's no shame in sort of pointing out that you're crushing it in your application. And finally, and I think this is a really important tip, make it personal. So write in the first person if you would like. Share your authentic passion. That's going to help the jury get excited. So Heidi, you've been a juror before, and you sort of touched a little bit on feeling the passion through some of these applications. How important is it as a juror to be sort of grabbed by the project and sort of feel the person behind the application? How important is that?
I think it's really, really important with most applications for sure, because again, you really want to see, there could be a number of people who maybe are doing similar projects, but it's the person who is so passionate about it, who's really put their everything into it, and you can feel that come off the page. It's hard to express in words what that is like, but there were just some applications where you can really tell that this person lives and breathes their craft, and that there's no question that them being able to do this project is going to be a great thing for them and for the others who get to witness it. Mm-hmm. And I just think really asking yourself, you know, what do I bring to the table that's different? Why is it that I'm the best person to do that? And being confident in that, and being able to express that on the page is really, really vital.
I think too, the next slide that we have here is to start strong. So think about what the jury is going to look at first and how you can make sure to answer the questions. That gives a juror an overview of what your project is and also gets them excited, you know. From my friend who's been a juror, they said that, you know, a strong start could significantly affect the lens through which they evaluated the whole application. If someone starts strong and the project that they're pitching, the entire jury, is exciting, and you can feel that energy from the first paragraph, it's going to get you through some of the other parts of the grant application that are a little less interesting, like the budget and, some of the other things that are less important, I think. And another thing that you touched on too, as a juror, and I think that this is kind of a cool thing to sort of think about, is you don't really know who's looking at your application, and they, if you do a really great job at sort of selling yourself and the work that you do, even if you're not successful in your grant, you might have made a connection with an artist across the country that you may work with again in the future, right? They might think, wow, I've never heard of this person before, but I'm going to make sure, like, after this, that I go follow them on their socials and I watch what they're doing. I'm really excited to see this artist's journey. It could almost even be a cool opportunity for you to make new connections across the country who may be interested in, partnering on projects in the future. So knowing that... Absolutely. Getting on somebody else's radar so that they're following what you're doing and they're excited about what you're doing, in many ways that's almost as valuable as getting the grant. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I noticed when I was with Canada Council, and this is something that people find really, really tricky, I have struggled with this so much, is using positive, forward-thinking language in that initial statement. Like you said, you want to start strong and start confident. And one thing that surprised me, but is actually quite effective, is using language that says, this is going to happen. You're confident that you're going to get this grant, or regardless of whether you get this grant, this project is going forward because it's important and it has value. And making statements like, let's say I'm an indie filmmaker, which I'm not, I know nothing about it, but let's say I want to make a film and it's called ABC Disability, and it's a short film that's dealing with educational or occupational barriers.
for people with disabilities, and my film will feature 8 different people with different voices from diverse backgrounds in Nova Scotia, and then ending with a really positive statement like, it will then be submitted for screening at BAAFF 2021 and will be streamed online everywhere. Like, making that statement that this project is going out into the world, and here's when, and here's how. You know, and maybe BAAFF changes, or maybe there's another pandemic and BAAFF gets moved online and the whole thing has to change. But going into it with that positive, you know, this is where I'm taking this project. So there.
It's sort of the dress for the job you want, not the job you have, kind of, but grants.
Yeah.
In grants.
Yeah.
You know,
absolutely.
right for the project you know you're going to do, not for the money that you hope you get, because otherwise you're not going to be able to do it.
Yeah.
Less impactful.
Yes.
So the next slide that we have is support material tips. So we've talked a lot about the support material already, so I'm just going to sort of cover these really quickly. Number 1, we've touched on this. If you need a letter, ask well in advance. It's just helpful for the organizations. You know, you never know what's on their plates, and you know, for a lot of us, if we're all writing grants at the same time for these same deadlines, you know, we're sort of like in the midst of it as well. So, you know, making sure to be accommodating of other people's time is really important. Choosing the best excerpts. Remember that jurors have very little time to review support material. They have about 10 minutes. So you don't want to give them material that they, you know, you want to start right at the important part. You know, you don't want to, if you're going to use a video clip, you don't want to start with something and sort of build tension to get where you need. You want to start exactly what you need them to see in order for them to get a full picture of the scope of your project. So
it's not a thriller.
Yeah, it's not a thriller. You need to get exactly where you need to go. So make sure your support material does that. And this thing I think is very important. The examples of your work are more important than the accolades. So if you've received writers' awards or you've received, you know, recognition, those are still important. But if you're going to choose those over like the support material, that I would push you the other way. That if you have support material that you think is going to be more helpful than knowing that you've received a certificate or an award, that you should put the priority on those things.
I would caution too that when you're thinking about gathering your support materials, just as we've said earlier, you know, we're not accountants. We're also not professional photographers or videographers. If they want visual images, you know, maybe think about your friend who has the best photos on Instagram, or who's a food photographer, or somebody who really knows about lighting and setting and all that. Because whether it's a theater piece or a painting or something, we all know that, you know, a photo can really do something justice, or a photo can actually take away from the artistic merit of something. So making sure that you've allowed enough time and that you've talked to your network of people so that you can get those really professional support materials in place well in advance, I think is super important. And it comes back to, you know, bartering and in-kind trading with somebody so that you can get their skills, maybe finding someone who's a professional writer who can read over your application, you know, do a copy edit at the end. You want to make sure that you haven't got a bunch of spelling or grammatical errors, and that's okay if that's not your forte, you know. Your forte is sculpting or whatever. You've never been super great with grammar. That's fine. Again, you try to get somebody who can help you just to make sure that everything is really tied together nicely.
So the next slide that we have is feedback. So when you submit a grant, whether it's successful or not, you'll receive sort of a notification letting you know the way that your application went. I forgot the word. Whether or not you were successful in receiving the funding. That's the word I forgot. So what this little piece of advice in terms of feedback is, even if you're successful, you should always ask for the feedback, because you can always grow and get better. It can also help you to know, like, oh, maybe I have written a grant that I thought was similar to this and I wasn't successful, but this grant I was successful. So what were the factors that led to my success in this grant? Because I want to keep being successful in grant writing. So I want to know what I did good so that I can continue to do that in the future. So knowing those things can be really helpful. And try to be open to feedback. I know it's so hard, especially like you said, some of these projects are our babies. You know, we love them. They're huge pieces of ourselves. And so when someone criticizes, you know, the merit of that project and says, well, I don't really see that being that important, or I don't really understand the impact that has on the community, that can wound you if you feel so passionate about its impact on the community. And so it can be hard to hear that feedback, but what you should hear in that feedback is that in that section of the grant, you didn't do the best that you could do. Maybe there's some other things you can tweak it. You can really lean in hard on the community. Maybe you focused a little too much on your expertise as an artist, and maybe they're confident in that. They want to see more what it has to do with the impact on the community. So getting that feedback can help you to either rewrite your grant and reapply with the same project and maybe be successful with the changes that they're suggesting you make. Or it could be just helpful to understand the way that you're writing maybe not accessible. And that could come back down to, we were talking about being clear and concise. You know, if people don't understand your project, you're probably not going to be successful in getting the funding that you're looking for. So knowing that can be really helpful, because then you're able to correct some of the mistakes that you made. So being open and listening to that feedback can be very helpful. And this is a very important last bit of advice when it comes to feedback. If the feedback is unhelpful, remember that jurors' opinions are subjective. So these are a group of people that have come together, and this particular group of people may not have seen the value in your application, but a different group of people may have. And that's true.
You can't control their tastes.
You can't control them.
Everybody has different tastes, everybody has different interests, and jurors try to come with an open mind, but it doesn't mean everybody's going to love your project, and that is not a personal attack, you know?
Yeah, and so if you feel like the feedback isn't helpful, you know, you could still reapply with the same application, and you might receive a different outcome because it's a different group of individuals gathered to discuss your project. So just knowing that too, if you get feedback and you don't feel like it's very helpful, that, you know, you just have to remind yourself that not everybody is going to understand and get your project. Not everybody's going to like it. And that's okay. And move on.
I was thinking about this last night, Kelsey, after we spoke yesterday about the word rejection. And it's such a negative word. We really need a new word, something that suggests, you know, keep trying, because that's what the feedback really is, you know. It doesn't mean, oh, this door is closed. It means you need to find another way to try to open that door. And we've just become, the word rejection has become so commonplace. It's like, oh, you weren't successful. You were rejected by the jury. And I really hope that together somehow we can come up with a new way of framing that. But it's not a rejection. It's a restart of kinds.
Yeah, it's just not ready yet. This application is not ready yet. You know, so you can decide, you know, once you receive your feedback, you can decide, you know what, maybe this project wasn't successful because my heart's not really in it. I don't actually really want to do this project anymore. Or my goals as an artist have completely changed since the time that I've written this application to receiving this letter. So you can decide to just say, you know what, I'm going to put this project to bed and I'm going to dream up a new project and I'm going to write a grant for that. That's okay. And just sort of knowing, that rejection is really hard. I really struggle with rejection a lot, and I know that that's like a part of my ADHD, is that rejection wounds me so badly. Like if I'm like, hey, do you want sugar in this coffee? And someone's like, no, I don't take sugar. I could be like so upset for a whole day that I'm like, how could I have forgotten that person doesn't like sugar in their coffee? I'm a bad person. So it's easy to sort of beat yourself up when you get a not ready yet instead of an unsuccessful or rejected application. If your application's not ready yet, you can feel like, ugh, why did I even try? Why did I even bother? And those imposter syndrome feelings can start to bubble back up again. But don't take that as this project's never going to be done. You know, you're never going to be able to do this project. It might just not be the right time for it yet. And you might find space for that project somewhere else. So don't give up hope.
Allow yourself to feel that sting,
Yeah.
and then brush yourself off and try.
Try again. And the last little bit of advice that we're going to give today is it's okay if things change. This year has been a year of a humongous change and sort of revisit, revise everything. And so it's okay if you write a grant. Like I said, sometimes you write a grant and it could be a couple of months before you hear back from the funding organization whether or not you've been successful. And in that time, a lot can change. And so it's okay if those things happen. You just have to be in constant communication with your program officer. If huge details like for example, during this year, we had a whole festival planned for June. And we were unable to have that festival. So we had to let our program officers know that we had tried our best, but that the world was changing and that at this point we didn't feel comfortable hosting these events in person. And everybody had to make those changes. And we've all been really on the phone with our program officers a lot this year, trying to shift and change and reimagine projects that we had imagined before the global pandemic. So give yourself that sort of space to change your project, to allow for those things to happen, to sort of roll with the changes that happen. This year has really taught us how to be resilient in terms of making art and presenting events. But just keep that in mind and know that there's a lot of things that can change, but for the most part, if the artistic goal of your project is the same, if you're still accomplishing and you're still meeting the criteria and the guidelines of that grant, it's okay if people change. You said you were going to work with one person, but now you're working with someone different. If the venue changes, if the mode in which you present your work changes from an in-person to a digital, those things are okay, and you just talk those things through with your granting officer to make sure that you're checking in and keeping them up to date on how that money's being used and how that project is coming along, because that's really what they care about.
Being flexible and being able to pivot, which you guys, such a great example with BAAFF this year and all the reachability events that you guys have just moved over to digital, and, from the outside, it looks really seamless, but I'm sure it was absolute, chaos at first for you guys. But that again, when you're talking to your program officer, they might be the ones who can suggest to you, well, maybe you could pivot this way. Mm-hmm. Maybe you could do it that way.
Yeah, especially if you're stuck, some of these, if you're not sure where to go, especially now with some of the projects, talking to your program officer, because they'll be having conversations with other artists and organizations and hearing how they're doing things, how other organizations are switching, pivoting. So yes, that's really great. So we're at the end of our presentation. I want to give a huge thank you to you, Heidi, for joining me today and having this conversation. It was super fun and engaging, especially when we're talking about something that is a little less, fun and engaging, a workshop on writing. But
it's really been my pleasure. I've enjoyed the whole process working with you to come to today's presentation. And I think we've offered a lot of really valuable tips. And as you said, we can be available to help people if they have questions. I know not everybody would have been able to join us live this morning. So by all means, shoot those emails to Kelsey at hello@baaff.ca.
Yay, Heidi! I'd also like to say a little thank you to our captioners and our ASL interpreters. Thank you for joining us today and helping to spread our message today. And I'd like to thank the tech crew and Carrie Marshall behind the camera for giving me thumbs up, just giving me a little encouragement. It's been really great. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. We'll talk to you soon. Goodbye.
Thank you.